So today we are working on some oil leaks. Got the dog, the butter dog. But anyways, we got an oil leak here and it's leaking from the valve cover. Let me get over here so you can hopefully see it. Not to get some better lighting, but right down in there underneath the valve cover on the back side, there's oil pretty much running down, and I can see it on top of the bell housing and all over there. Now on this Jeep, I just changed the rear main seal and the oil pan gasket while I had the transmission out doing the clutch, and we still got the leak here. I should have been smarter. I didn't really think much of it. I haven't had too many leaky valve covers to this extent. I just had a pretty big puddle there, and there's a ton coming from that area in the back of the engine earlier. So when I was in there doing the transmission, I figured I'd do the pan and the rear main seal while I was in there. So I went through all new seals on those two areas, but I didn't get the valve cover yet, so I'm gonna do that right now. And that's where the oil's coming from. You can tell it's not coming anywhere from the rear main seal area or pan gasket anymore. It's just dripping basically off the back of that valve cover. So we have got a cheap Fel-Pro gasket. It's the cork one. I'd rather get, not the cork one, something that was rubber or silicone and actually had the holes punched out for the bolts, but this should work, assuming it actually lines up on there, which it may not, but we'll find out. So to do this, pretty straightforward. It's going to be a short video. There's going to be a bunch of bolts all around the valve cover, and some of them will be holding down spark plug, plastic little separators, and a bunch of other plastic things. But just take all those out, and then we'll try to move some of this stuff out of the way. Probably take the throttle cables off just to lift them up, get them out of the way enough to pull the valve cover out, and then we'll clean up that gasket plate surface and we'll throw in the new cork gasket. So be back in just a second once I buzz these out. I'm guessing they're all 7/16 if I had to guess, but we'll find out. Okay, so we've gotten the valve cover removed. We have the new gasket, cork gasket sitting there. We've got everything cleaned up for the mating surfaces with brake clean. Made sure not to get any old gasket or anything into the valves. They were all 7/16. There was a few things on the spark plug side, little plastic stuff that were a little bit tricky and broke. But other than that, pretty straightforward. I didn't have to remove any of the cruise control or the throttle cable. I just moved them up out of the way while I slid the valve cover out this side. So we didn't have to take any of that off. Now we're just going to throw the valve cover back on and bolt everything up. Pretty straightforward. So that's going to be a valve cover. I'll probably have something else to say after this at the very end, but the gasket obviously is not going to stick on here as I wrestle it through there. So I'm going to put the gasket on first, and then I'll pull the stuff out of the way, and I'll slide the valve cover in there and then set it on, and we'll bolt it down and cross our fingers. So things are never quite as easy as you'd like them to be. I ended up having to take off the throttle cable, which is right here, and then the cruise control, which I already hooked back up. I had to take them both off and get, obviously the PCV and then everything off the top of the valve cover so I could lift it straight up. Now, these coolant hoses, realistically, they should have been moved out of the way as well, to be honest, because they were in my way. The little cork gasket that I got was kind of, I probably should have spent more. It was like $8 for the cork gasket, and it was like $35 for a silicone or some other type of gasket that actually had eyelets where the bolts would go through, which probably would have been smarter. Would have been less frustrating, but I didn't want to spend $40 on a valve cover gasket. So I went with the $9 8 and change for this cork one, and it didn't have any eyelets for these bolts to go through around the valve cover. And in my opinion, bad design here by Jeep, but if you flip the valve cover open, on the underside of it, there's actually a little ridge that goes and wiggles along all of the cylinders where the valve cover gasket will actually press into, and it's got to fit up against that. In my opinion, they should have put that ridge on the top of the head so you can just set the gasket on there and then wiggle the valve cover and press it down on there. So this way, with it being on the underside of the valve cover, as soon as you turn the valve cover over, if you start wiggling it or shaking it or too much or moving it around, it's gonna fall off. Essentially, that gasket isn't gonna seat properly. So I had to remove almost everything. I should have taken off these coolant hoses. I didn't. Hopefully I got it seated properly, but I had to get the throttle cable out and the cruise control cable, everything out of the way, so I could pretty much just drop it straight down so that I could hold it like this, the valve cover, with the gasket on the underside, hold it in the ridges and drop it straight down without it falling out of place. And I think I got it. The only place I'm worried about is on this side by the fuel rail, because this side kept giving me trouble originally, so I ended up holding that side with more care. Now, why I didn't want to take off this in the first place, the throttle, is because of all this old plastic stuff. Get some light. It just tends to break pretty much every time it breaks, and my throttle cable broke right there on this side. The other end of this clip broke, so I'll shove it back in there, right in through here in the bracket, and we'll see if it holds up, and I'm gonna hook it back up. But essentially, that's how you replace the valve cover gasket. I don't know, if you don't care about money, buy the $35 gasket. If you want to end up yelling at the Jeep, buy the $8 gasket.